Hello everyone, this is Mohammad Hasibul Hasan, Director of Event Management Breakthrough, a carnival for efficient work. You all know that Russia University International Affairs and Business Society has launched an event named Breakthrough. We have total of 8 contests in our carnival, and one of them is a short story and poem writing contest. So today we are having a workshop on short story and poem writing contest. So not doing further delay, let me introduce to our judge for our short story and poem writing. We are presenting Raisa Ashraf Apu. Hello Apu, how are you?
Hello, I'm doing all right, Alhamdulillah. I hope you're
Uh,
doing well as well.
yes, Apu, I am also fine. We are very privileged to have you as our judge, and thank you for make your time for our workshop. It will be very good for our participant, and they could understand the contest very well, I think. With your due permission, can we start our workshop?
Of course, of course. We
Uh,
can.
Acha, okay, Apu. We have some questions for you. Let me ask you. Uh, Apu, what do you think that you there? It will be better for our participant that you will give a overview of our short story and poem writing contest, and what should be the what should be the content that should be in a short story or poem, you think?
Um, if you
What
don't
are the
mind me
basic thing
asking, would
mainly?
you repeat the question?
Okay, Apu.
Would you repeat the question
Actually,
again?
okay, Apu. Apu, I'd like to request you that to give a overview of our contest, our short story and poem writing, and what do you think that what a poem or a story should contain the basic elements that a story or poem should contain?
Um, okay. So the first thing that you asked is the overview of the short story writing and poem writing. Um, it's I think for any um, potential writer, some of the issues that are important to remember is that um, there are distinctive differences in writing short stories and poetry. Um, for example, in poetry, আমরা যখন কোনো কবিতা পড়ি, ওখানে যে সেন্টেন্সেস গুলা usually অনেক short ভাবে লেখা হয়. They're short, they're apt, and they don't necessarily have to rhyme together. However, ha- don't they don't necessarily have to be full sentences আর কি. অথচ in short stories, even though the whole length of the story itself isn't like that of a full novel or a novella for that matter, but we expect you will be using proper language, English বা বাংলা আপনি যেটাতে যে ভাষাই লেখেন না কেন, স্ট্যান্ডার্ড ল্যাঙ্গুয়েজ হতে হবে, স্পেলিং, grammar, এগুলো তো ঠিক হতেই হবে. Those are the basic things which I don't think I need to elaborate more on. And when it comes to writing styles of short stories, one of the more important points is যে short story ক্ষেত্রে the writer has more freedom in terms of writing styles. You can first person লেখা যায়, third person লেখা যায়, even second person লেখা যায়. So being able to see যে how the writer manages to play with the language, that's something which I really enjoy when I'm reading a book. So that's, I think, one of the important points that I'll always keep an eye on when I'm reading any short story or any poems for that matter. The writer being able to portray their own voice regardless of how they're writing it or what language they might be using. I don't know if I make sense to you.
No, Apu, it is very quite understandable for our participant, I think.
Okay, so the second point that you asked me to elaborate on, which is the key elements that I hope to see in short story writing and poetry.
Yes.
So, like we were actually talking about before this session started, Jay, I have been thinking about some of the things which I enjoy seeing in whatever I read, basically. The first thing that's very important to me is যে আপনি যখন যেটা নিয়ে লেখুন না কেন, whether it's about a memory that you may have or an event or even a simple object, for example, do your research on that object. যে একটা event, যে example, if you're talking writing about an event, try to read up more about it, try to get the history behind why this particular event happened, or if you are writing about a particular object, read up on it. How was it made? What led to it being, what led to that object being actually made? Read up on it, try to figure out its history. That's something which is fascinating. And when you know how this event or how this object or how this incident came to be, it becomes easier for a writer to play with the words, to play with the language. That's important to remember. So that's one thing that I feel is very important. So that the research part is one important thing, and the second point that I find is almost equally important is when you're starting to write something, you can't be confused about what you want to write. Often a lot of writers start writing and they figure out what they want to write about while they are writing. This type of writing often works when you have had more practice of writing, or if you've had practice in professional writing for a couple of years now. And only then I think I would be comfortable with letting someone write someone like almost blindsidedly, if I can put it that way. But especially when someone is participating in a competition like this, when you start writing, you need to be absolutely sure first about what you want to write about. An easy way to figure that out is something academics or your school teachers will term as brainstorming. একটা normal A4 size paper, you just start writing or scribbling gibberish and try to figure out what's running through your mind, what are potential ideas or topics for writing, anything. And when you come to a conclusion about what you are most comfortable with, that basically creates a foundation for your poetry or your short story overall. So that's the second point that's equally important, if not more. There's this another element which I find is very important. যে আপনি যখনই কিছু, whether you're writing a poem or a short story, try not to use overcomplicated words. অনেকে এটা, a lot of them confuse things with it. If I use too many complicated words, my writing will become better, or the reader might be impressed if I use as many complicated words as possible, or complicated sentences even for that matter. But it's important to note that using complicated words and complicated sentences for that matter should only be used in your favor if it benefits the storyline or benefits the narrative. If it doesn't help you in any way, using complicated words and sentences is completely useless. Um, um, yeah, মানে এটাই যে try this I can't emphasize enough on this যে not always does using complicated words let you write something nice. You could write with the most basic words, basic sentences, and still end up having something extremely beautiful. I don't know if I make sense here, but yeah. You can ask me, you can interrupt me at any point if you feel like I'm not here or I need to.
No, it is quite understandable, and it's very clear. I think all of us can understand you very much clearly.
So I actually have another basic continuing from where I left off in the last point, not using complex words or complex sentences for that matter. It's also important to remember is it's okay not to have a complex storyline as well. If I can use an example here, আমরা তো অনেকেই রবীন্দ্রনাথের গল্প বা কবিতা আমরা তো ছোটবেলা থেকেই বেসিক্যালি পড়ে আসি. If you have ever read his work with certain concentration or anything, you will notice যে অনেক সময় ওনার কোনো গান বলেন বা কোনো কবিতা বলেন, he writes about the randomest of things. মাঝে মাঝে একটা পাতার উপরে একটা পানির ফোঁটা পড়ছে, ওটা নিয়ে উনি গান লিখে ফেলতে পারতেন. একটা পোস্টমাস্টার, সে তার চাকরি নিয়ে ঝামেলা হচ্ছে, ওটা নিয়ে সে একটা short story লিখে ফেলছে. And they turned out to be some of the most beloved poems, songs, and short stories of the masses. So our storylines, whenever either of the poems or the short stories that anyone submits, they don't necessarily have to be on complex storylines. অনেক সময় it becomes very overwhelming for the writer themselves. So keep it simple, I would say, but write it well. The story can be about the most silliest thing ever, but it can be absolutely beautiful. I remember I was if I'm not sure if anyone is interested in spoken word poetry or anything like that, but I'm a huge fan of spoken word poetry. It's basically a performed version of poetry writing. There was this one performance which I was watching once a couple of years ago. It was by a writer or poet called Phil K. He was talking about this program that he was working on while in university, where he volunteered in a high security prison and taught some of the prisoners how to write, basically a writing course for them. And he talked about one of the prisoners once writing about an extremely well-timed fart. That's what he wrote about. It's very silly. I laughed out when I first heard it, but it was extremely well written. So, like I said, it can be about the silliest of things. It can be about farts even, but it has to be well written. And I think that's important. You don't have to write complex things to be a good writer. And it doesn't need to have the most incredible plot twists either. It can be simple things with simple twists, but again, it has to be well written. I think nothing beats a good old well written story as long as the writer stays true to its intentions. Nothing has to be too complex. And this has a lot to do with the writer knowing what the purpose of this writing is. The writer needs to know why they are writing something. কবিতা হলে কেন কবিতা লিখছেন? Is it because you find something disturbing? Is it because you find something beautiful? Is it because you absolutely love or hate, for that matter, of a bird's movement or someone's style of talking? It can be about anything, but you need to know why you're writing it in the first place. And once you figure out all of this, I think you have pretty much everything, every tool you need to start writing, and write it beautifully, for that matter. And that actually also lets you have the most catchiest starting, which I believe is also very important. This is actually one of my last points that I would like to mention for the questions about the key elements that I like about any short story or any poem, for that matter. When it comes to, if I may give you a certain example of catchy startings, so that those who are watching this right now know that what I'm talking about. I'm not sure if you've ever heard of the writer and poet called Humayun Azad. One of his books, which was published in 2004, if I'm not wrong, it literally the first line of the book started with Pagzar Zameen Asman blah la la la. That's basically the first line of the Pakistani national anthem. And he didn't even finish the first line of it. And that's how he started that particular book that he wrote. And for a person like me who enjoys different types of short stories, or stories for that matter, catchy openings like these are always fascinating. There was this another poem that I read or listened to actually a couple of years ago. It's had another opening which I feel is interesting, because even though the full poem itself was written and performed in English, the first word that the writer used was in Japanese. If you don't mind, I think I have the book with me, and if you don't mind, I would like to read the first couple of lines so that you would know what I'm talking about. Can I?
Yes, Apu, we can.
Okay, so it's basically, the poem is called Teeth. It's by Phil K. Again, I keep referring back to him because he's one of my favorite poets, one of my favorite English poets, for that matter. So the first couple of lines, he starts and he writes about his grandfather, actually, about his grandfather being a World War II veteran, and that's what he starts with. It says, Odichima is what I call my Japanese grandfather. In 1945, his Tokyo home burned to the ground. Grampy is what I call my American grandfather. In 1945, he was serving on the USS Shangri-La, sending off American fighter pilots to burn down Japanese houses. Our jaws have not yet healed. So basically, he starts these two sentences with two completely different words. Ojichima being the Japanese word for his Japanese grandfather, and Grampy being the English word for his American grandfather. So, like I said, you can be creative with how you start, but it has to be catchy. And I think that's what differentiates between, or at least helps a person know, or let the person know what story is a good story, or what poem is a good poem, and what poem, short story, or is a good or bad one. The differences between how the writer starts and how well they manage to move on to the main story itself. That's very important. I hope I make sense to you right now.
Yes, Abu, you pretty much do, and you're doing amazing. I guess the audiences are absolutely loving your insights. So, however, Abu, moving on to the next question. The next question is that what's the basic difference between a story and a short story? What actually differences that's created by both of them?
Uh, like I said, like I initially said, one of the main differences, of course, the sentence structures. In the sentence structures of short stories, or any story for that matter, is usually um, longer in length. They can be short stories can have a variation of short sentences, long sentences, complex ones, simple ones. Basically, short stories have a habit of playing with different sizes and styles of sentence writing. Basically, in poetry, we of course have much shorter sentences. They do not have to be. The poems do not always have to rhyme. For example, the one that I read a little while ago, I don't think it had a single pair of sentences which rhymed properly. But it's the content of the story and the opening, of course. They're the ones which attracts the writer, reader, into reading the whole thing. It has to have that flow which makes sense and helps the story itself grow. And I think that's similar to how short stories work as well. The sentences you use can be a mixture of short and long sentences in short stories, as long as it has a good opening, a good transition between different parts of the stories, and a good ending. So that's important to remember. That's one of the main differences between short stories and poetries on how they're written. I think another difference is, of course, usually when it comes to story writing, we can often play with different styles of writing. We can write extremely descriptively, or we can be extremely narrative, or we could talk about it in complete first person perspective or narrative. these are usually easier to deal with when we are writing short stories. With poetry, it's a little more difficult because the sentences in poetry is usually so compact, and paragraphs in poems usually aren't that long. So usually, I'm basically talking about general cases, of course. So it's usually a bit more difficult to play with different styles of writing in poetry, um, whether it's narrative or descriptive or first person. It's a bit more, um, it's actually a lot more difficult to work with when you're writing a poem. Unless, of course, you are working with a free verse um, poetry, that makes it a little more easier, but of course, it's still something which a lot of people find it hard to get used to. I don't know if I make sense to you right now, but yeah. Yeah. Um, so that's I think some of the more important points between the different key differences of these two styles of writing.
বুঝতে পারছে যে
Hello?
Hello, আপু, can't you hear me?
এখন শুনতে পারছি।
জি আপু, মানে তাহলে আমরা নেক্সট কোশ্চেনে মুভ করি।
Of course.
আচ্ছা আপু, you have stated guideline that the story, short story and poem should be within 150 words to 250 words. So what do you want to give any tips to maintain the word limits?
I think one point that I mentioned in the beginning, Jay, you have to know what you want to write about. That's very important. If you don't know what you want to write about, it usually becomes very hard to manage your word limit. So I would suggest that try to brainstorm as much as possible. Try, if something interests you, try to read up on it as much more. If it does not have enough possibilities or scopes for research, try to talk to other people about it a bit more, or try to figure out a way to basically know more about your interests in what you plan on writing. Otherwise, if you let yourself write about the issue almost completely blindly, it becomes very hard to manage your word limit. And the other important thing that, or point that you need to remember, is that it's always a good idea to when you're brainstorming, to basically write down the format of the type of format that you would like to follow in your writing, which point you would like to add to which part of the story, how you would want to introduce the characters or the idea that you're presenting, what happens in the middle of the story. Is there any dilemma that the characters face? Is there anything which catches the characters off guard? Right? Or basically anything which you would like to add to the middle, and how does issues come to an end, if there are any? How they get their closure, if I can put it that way. So trying to maintain that structure, specific structure, that opening, the middle, the end, that helps. So that's something which any writer should remember, or at least try to remember. Of course, a lot of writers usually don't follow these particular types of writing, which is okay, as long as you know what you're doing, as long as you know where you want to put certain aspects of the story. That's the most important part. You have to know what you're writing about, how you want to write it, and where you want to put certain issue aspects of the story.
Okay,
Yeah,
Apu.
that's
Quite
about it
understandable.
for when it comes to managing the word limit.
Yes, Apu. Yeah. Yeah, Apu. So move to our next question. Some of our participants may have the question about plagiarism. How you, if you would clarify it to our participant, it will be better.
Okay, so if anyone has read through the um, guidelines that was uploaded into the page, I think they would be able to notice যে আমি plagiarism শব্দটার পাশে I wrote this sentence যে any um, if you are referring to any other source for the purposes of your writing, and if while checking through the writing, if um, 3 or more words um, is copied word for word without any reference or any type of acknowledgement towards the original writer or author, it's usually considered plagiarism. Even if you don't know how to acknowledge the original writer, if you choose to refer to another piece of writing, just put in a footnote and mention it at the end of the page that this is taken from what source, who originally wrote it, why was it inserted inside the story as it was. That would help me clarify that okay, the original intention was not to copy and paste it, but to use it for the purposes of the story, and at the same time acknowledging the work of the original writer. I think that's the most important part.
Yes, Apu, and it is totally forbidden of plagiarism, and if anyone found, the participant will be disqualified. Uh, Apu,
Yes, yes.
another question for you, that we are encouraging our participants that they write different kinds of style of writing. They and so like monologues, narratives, describing writing.
Descriptive.
If you descriptive writing. Apu, if you want, please explain this to our participant. It will be better.
Okay. So it's the often the differences between these styles of writing is a little subtle. It takes a little concentration to figure out what's the difference, but once you get the hang of it, it's very easy to figure out which is what. Usually, so I explicitly mentioned 3 different styles of writing, but of course, the author or writer can use any other style of writing too. One of the style of writing that I mentioned was a monologue. Monologue basically is um, a right. It's usually a particularly difficult style of writing, so I don't expect everyone to get up on their first, second, or even 10th try for that matter. It usually deals with only one character who speaks throughout the story or poem, how they refer back to different incidents if necessary, but they're the only ones talking. It's almost like the character is talking to themselves, or even if they're talking to someone else, they are not letting anyone else talk. They're the only one talking about the whole story. There's no break inside the story or poem for dialogues. If there are, it's usually presented as a memory or as a reference by the made by the character. So it's basically just one person speaking throughout the whole writing, and no one else um, is brought in. That's what a monologue is. Um, Descriptive writing, it's of course one of the easier ones. It's when, um, for example, um, a little while back ago, I was talking about one of Rabindranath's short stories about that postmaster, for example. If we were to write about a person, or if we were to write about basically a similar short story, um, focusing on one particular person or one particular area and just describing how that person looks or how that area looks, what that person is wearing, um, how they keep their hair, whether their dresses are ironed well enough or whether they're crumpled. Basically, focusing on how they're presented and not more, and the incident, focusing on that and talking about them in length. That's what description or descriptive writing would be. Describing incidents, describing people over and over again. So that's what a descriptive writing entails. On the other hand, a narrative wouldn't probably be as descriptive as the one I just mentioned, but it would focus more on the storyline and the chronology on about and how the incident happened, what triggered the incident, what happened first, then what it led to, what the outcome was. Basically, letting the story flow for itself in a particular style of narration. That's what narratives usually are. Like, yeah, and often these distinct, it's almost as if for those who like to read, these different styles of writing are a lot like different personalities. You won't be able to see the difference unless you are used to reading a lot and are able to distinguish between them as a result of you reading so much. So it takes practice to develop the writing skills, the different styles of writing skills. But once you get them, get the hang of it, it's quite encouraging, quite unsatisfying. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I think this will be helpful for our participant, and they could understand about the different types of writings. And Apu, the one more last question. That what do you think? How would this story and poem writing contest should benefit our academic life?
Um, for I think writing competitions of any form is usually helpful in one way or the other. For example, I have always enjoyed writing since I was a kid. I've always tried playing with different styles of writing. As a result, what happened was that when I got to my university life, I had to, because of the different types of courses that I had to do, I was able to utilize my writing skill in my courses. Even though in the higher level advanced courses, you are encouraged to write more formally, even then, some of the skills that I ended up developing, for example, in many of my courses, I am all encouraged to submit one or two written journal entries on the readings that we read for the course. And even though journal entries are usually a little laid back, it doesn't have to be too formal. I was able to write it in my own style. I was able to um, make my viewpoints clear. And if I wanted to play around a little with my writing, that was allowed too. So I was able to actually showcase not only my um, ability to understand the course materials, but ability to talk about them and write about them well enough in different styles of writing in my courses. And that has oftentimes, more often than not, it has let me uh, earn a higher grade or scores in those courses than I would usually have. I remember in one of my courses back in AUW, I was a student of Asian University for Women. One of my first courses there, it was called Introduction to Asian Religions. It was the professor that I had, Professor John Schroeder. He was one of my favorites from AUW. He used to make us write weekly journals for his course, and what I ended up doing is that I ended up writing the journal entries in the form of letters, in the form of personal letters where I talked about the course materials that we covered in class. Not only did I manage to talk about it, I managed to pull in some of my own opinions on them and show what my own understanding of the readings were. So that led to Professor being extremely impressed because not only was I showcasing my ability to handle tough readings, but I was also showing at the same time my ability to handle different styles of writing too. So that led me to that basically impressed him enough to give me a higher grade than a lot of my peers in the same class. Because I managed to take that risk or leap of faith, if I can say, to play with um, the course materials. So you can always take writing to your advantage in universities or even after universities. If you are interested in writing, you can always play around with different writing styles. So you just have to find a way how to pull them into your work. Yeah.
Yes, Apu, as you say, it is very important for our academic life, and I think it will all help us all to make our academic life more fruitful, and uh, our thoughts should be came out through our story and poems. And Apu, one more question from our viewers. Let me introduce it. The question is from Ajmain Adil Anakib, and it is it necessary for a short story to have a ending or of the story, or should a short story rather leave suspense than giving an ending?
It's completely it's completely allowed. It's completely possible to leave the readers guessing on the story itself. Um, if you're able to use it to your advantage, it's always possible. You can always leave the ending unfinished as long as you know that you have to use it to your advantage, to your story's advantage. If you can't, it's usually falls flat, or because all the hard work that you had trying to build the story and then not tying things up properly, it can often be a little confusing for many. But if you can leave the suspense at the right moment, at the right time, I think it's completely fine. Um, you don't always have to in a proper ending, as long as the suspense is well timed.
Uh, Thank you, Apu, for your concern and this workshop. I think our participant understand about our contest very much for listening to your workshop. It will be helpful from them to write a good story, and I think you will get some good story and poetry for judgment.
Of
So,
course.
Apu, with your due permission, can we close? Can we close to this
Of course.
workshop?
Of course. It was my pleasure to be a part of this. I'm glad uh, you thought I was good enough for this. So thank you to the organizers as well.
Thank you, Apu. Actually, it is our pleasure to have you with us as a judge. So that's all from today's workshop. Our registration is going on, and only 7 days to left. So do hurry and register for our event breakthrough, and I hope you will have a good time with our events. Thank you.